Welcome to Notepad. I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani. Last Friday, the Prime Minister announced the stimulus package or Prihatin amounting to close to 250 billion ringgit with cash capital injection of about 25 billion ringgit. Many of those are still being lauded and being praised by many, factions or parties. But we want to focus a little bit on the problem that are currently facing by the frontline people right now. Because we know that over the past few days, plenty of organizations have indeed given supplies, ventilators, face masks, gloves. All of that has been donated into the Malaysian government system by various parties, anywhere from Alibaba or Jack Ma all the way to private hospitals and private organizations. But is this systematic? Is this how we are going to move forward when we talk about acquiring or acquisitioning these kind of materials? Because remember, the front lines need this equipment the most. And while we thank all the parties that have donated these kind of facilities to our frontliners as well as our back-enders, we have to ask ourselves, is there a proper way to manage crisis procurement or procuring items in a crisis time like this? So in this mood of conversation right now, we have on the line with us, joining us from Skype, Dr. Khor, Kheng, a good friend of mine who is in Malaysia after spending some time in the UK at Oxford University. Dr. Khor, again, thanks for taking the time to speak with us. I understand you are under quarantine. And believe me, when I say this, I exactly know how you feel because I myself am currently being quarantined as well. But we want to talk a little bit about the issue of the procurement process under crisis moments like this. The thing that I want to touch most is, of course, on what does Malaysia need right now and where do we get it, how do we get it, how is the thing going to be delivered to us? These are the pertinent questions that we have to understand. Dr. Khor, please elaborate a little bit better about where we can get all these procurement processes.
Ibrahim, it's a pleasure to be back. Malaysia at the moment needs many types of different medical equipment. And without going through a laundry list of it, let me put three items that we need quite urgently. The first one will be test kits. This will help us mass test the population so that we can identify those who have the disease and then we can appropriately treat them and isolate them, including perform contact tracing so that we can see those among them who are their friends and family who could have been exposed to the disease. So Malaysia will need lots and lots of test kits so that we can appropriately implement mass testing, which has been proven as a strategy to fight this disease in China, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. So the first thing that Malaysia needs is mass testing supplied by a lot of testing kits. The second thing that Malaysia needs right now in terms of medical equipment will be personal protective equipment or PPEs. When we say PPEs, it's actually a very broad category. What we mean is the face masks or the shields, as well as the gloves and the overall gowns that we wear, so that frontliners like medical professionals will not be exposed to the virus. That's the second thing that Malaysia needs: personal protective equipment. The third thing that Malaysia needs at the moment is a surge supply in ventilators. When we say ventilators, these are large objects and quite complicated objects that are used inside intensive care units. And there are generally two types of ventilators. The first one is the non-invasive. The second one is the invasive. The invasive type of ventilators is the one where a tube is put into your throat to help you breathe because the tube goes into the lungs. A non-invasive one does not have a tube. So that's the two different types of ventilators. But let me give a very high-level summary. Malaysia needs three things right now. We need lots and lots of test kits. We need lots and lots of personal protective equipment. And thirdly, we need a few more ventilators. And when I say a few more, I think in the region of hundreds or so. Unfortunately, these three needs that we have of test kits, personal protective equipment, as well as ventilators are almost not manufactured in Malaysia. Almost entirely, we rely on external supply. The factory of the world is China. And China's really producing ventilators and personal protective equipment, as well as a large number of testing kits, essentially for the whole world. Because they're the factory of the world, Malaysia cannot miss the opportunity to procure from China. So while I've already described to you the three things that Malaysia needs in terms of test kits, personal protective equipment, as well as ventilators, if we don't have domestic production in Malaysia for these three items, what we then have to do is to go out and procure it from other countries. Let's give some examples. In terms of test kits, the World Health Organization has released a regularly updated database of companies as well as test kit manufacturers. Malaysia can procure from many of these manufacturers, all of whom are scattered around the world. Our Institute for Medical Research in Malaysia does great research. They themselves can produce these test kits, but their capacity to produce these test kits is quite limited, which is why we have to quite quickly go overseas to buy the test kits, for example, from Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, as well as China. And we can cross-check this against the WHO database of, shall we say, approved, is not endorsed by the World Health Organization, because the World Health Organization will not take a commercial position, but is approved and meets their testing standards. These are the example countries that we can go to. For personal protective equipment, we can definitely go to China. For ventilators, we can definitely go to China as well. What's crucial to note is that it's not only Malaysia that is going shopping, shall we say, for kits, personal protective equipment, as well as ventilators. The whole world is going shopping. The United States and the European Union are going to China as well, because China's the factory of the world, like I've said earlier. So Malaysia must be careful that we're not last in line. We want to be first in line so that we can acquire the stockpile, so to speak, and all the equipment that we really need. And that's where the equipment will come from. In parallel to that, and perhaps the final point to this first question, is to say that it's important for Malaysia to consider two additional elements. If we're not first in line, we must also consider that the global shortage of all these items, as well as a high demand and low supply, would mean that we have to pay a little bit more. We then have to consider two things. Number one, ramping up the capacity for manufacturing in Malaysia, which could mean that we have to retool some of our industries. For example, fabrics and textiles and clothing factories could be remodeled and retooled to produce alternative PPEs or personal protective equipment. For good and bad, and this is, I guess, something that we need to consider, and I'm by no means saying that this is a magic solution. An open source ventilator design has already been released by the MIT, the Institute of Technology in America, one of the world's leading engineering schools. MIT, one of the world's best engineering universities, have released an open source design for a ventilator. By no means am I saying that this is a magic solution to our problem, because it might have pros and cons that we need to carefully consider. If push comes to shove, and Malaysia needs ventilators and we can't source it from other countries, then it's important that we rely on ourselves and our domestic manufacturing capacity in order to produce alternatives to what we can't get in the international market. All in all, Ibrahim, we need three things. We need test kits, we need personal protective equipment, and we need ventilators. We can't get them locally because our domestic manufacturing can't keep up with the demand that we need. Therefore, we need to source externally from countries like Korea and Taiwan and Singapore and China. And we need to be first in line so that we're not left behind in the race for this very limited supply of medical equipment.
Thanks. Dr. Khor, we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll discuss a little bit better about what you have just unearthed. Stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Thanks for staying on with us. You're watching Notepad. I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani. Joining me via Skype is Dr. Khor, Swee, Kheng of Oxford University. Dr. Khor, picking up from what you have just said just now, particularly when we talk about procuring items for the frontliners, how is this different from procuring things during peacetime? versus what we're going through right now, which is a crisis period right now? How are things different?
We'll perhaps begin, Ibrahim, by looking at the characteristics of peacetime procurement, and then we start talking about how is it different during a wartime procurement, shall we say. Here I bring some lessons from the compliance world. I was a director of ethics and compliance for a Fortune 100 company. I was operating in countries like Egypt and Russia and the Central Asian republics and Africa. I had an insight into the way governments will operate their procurement. And during peacetime, procurement has three main objectives. The first objective is value for money. For the amount of money that you have, you want to have the greatest amount of value, for example, the largest number of test kits or the largest number of ventilators and the best quality PPEs that you can get. That's the first objective of procurement, value for money. The second objective for procurement is actually quality. Quality in terms of the actual product that you procure. Obviously, there are important characteristics. For example, it must be fast, it must be responsive to the needs of the people who are actually using it, the frontliners who are using it, and clearly it must be accountable, it must be transparent, it must not be corrupt, and we must ruthlessly eliminate intermediaries and middlemen so that they don't slow down the process, add corruption into the process, or make the process completely inefficient and reduce value for money. Those are the characteristics during peacetime procurement, for example. During wartime procurement, there are some, say, problems, well, worse, shall we say, than during peacetime procurement. The first of this is any inefficiencies during peacetime procurement will be magnified during wartime procurement. How? Because there's a lot of confusion, a lot of lack of clarity, a lot of people making decisions and not really being transparent or being held accountable to those decisions. Therefore, more opportunities for inefficient procurement, more opportunities for corruption, more opportunities for middlemen and intermediaries to come in completely unnecessarily. And clearly, we don't want people to monopolize it because we need a diversified supply chain. If there's one person or one company that's monopolizing the procurement process, aside from the corruption and so on and so forth, it's also what happens during a wartime if that company collapses for any one reason. So we must diversify our supply chain. That's one big difference. The inefficiencies of peacetime procurement will be magnified during wartime procurement. The second big difference during wartime procurement versus peacetime procurement is that during wartime procurement, demand is sky high and the supply is even lower than during peacetime. That imbalance between demand and supply means that Malaysia has to be very thoughtful and very careful about how we navigate this landscape. One of my friends who's well connected into the Chinese market tells me that Brazil, just a few days ago, and Brazil's a country that's about 7 times more populous than Malaysia. We're about 30 million, they're about 210 million. So they're 7 times more populous than Malaysia. Brazil has put in an order for 15,000 ventilators. Malaysia at the moment, between the public and private sector, has about 1,500 ventilators. So Brazil, in one order, has ordered 10 times more than the existing capacity of ventilators in Malaysia. Demand's going high, supply is going low. So when you look at the difference between a wartime and peacetime procurement, there are two main differences. There are many differences, but the two main differences would be, firstly, more opportunities for inefficiencies, corruption, lack of accountability, lack of transparency, more middlemen coming in, simply benefiting from the chaos and the confusion surrounding it. And secondly, this huge disparity between supply and demand that we must be very careful about. All in all, the procurement practices in Malaysia during wartime, right now, could benefit from a couple of things, and we can talk about this in a bit. But firstly, it could benefit from more speed, which means removing intermediaries where possible. Secondly, it could benefit from going straight to source, for example, including opening pre-purchase, that's my term, pre-purchase lines into China, because the equipment that we want to source has got one additional complexity. We're not sourcing, an iron or an ironing board or a chair or furniture, which are low risk. We're sourcing some material which are high risk in a sense that a ventilator makes life and death decisions, and we want it to be completely reliable. Therefore, we have regulatory standards, standards for the operation and the use of these ventilators, as well as the approval of these items. So the could mean that we block an order, for example, of 1,000 ventilators, example only 1,000 ventilators, but the first 10 ventilators have to be delivered. We do a QA or a quality assessment on those ventilators to make sure that they're good for us before the other 990 are delivered. Now, these numbers are just for example's sake and not really reflective of the need of Malaysia. So to go back to the original question, the differences between wartime and peacetime procurement. Firstly, the inefficiencies during peacetime, including corruption and so on and so forth, could be magnified during wartime. Secondly, we must be mindful about the spike in demand and manage that at the global scale.
Right. We'll take one more short break before we come back to the actionable items that the government can take and how we as people can actually induce the government on taking them. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. You are watching Notepad, and while we are enjoying our moment at home for many of us, and for those at the front line executing their duties because of the fact that they are being called essential services, I salute each and every one of you, all the men and women currently serving the front lines, including that of our medical practitioners, our security services people. All of those people are currently putting themselves at risk in order to prevent or downplay the issue of COVID-19. In the meantime, I have with me Dr. Khor Kheng of Oxford University talking about the issues of procuring the medical front lines or medical items. Dr. Khor, let's conclude our conversation moving forward. How do you think Malaysia can move forward in doing what is needed? What can Malaysia do right now when we talk about procuring items?
Ibrahim, I'm glad you asked this question. Malaysia's large. We have 32 million people. We have different types of Malaysians organized in different communities. And when you put all of them together, there's a lot that we can do. I will offer 3 thoughts of what we can do, Ibrahim, but allow me to start by first categorizing Malaysia into a few entities easily understand. The first one is the Malaysian government and the entire apparatus of government. We're talking National Security Council, ministries, health, transport, foreign affairs, and so on, or the government agencies, universities, and so on. The second group of Malaysians would be, say, the private sector. And in the private sector, we have a few categories as well. We've got the government-linked corporations, the Hazanas, Petronas, Telecoms, and Tenagas of Malaysia. We also have the small and medium enterprises of Malaysia, comprising a large part of our economy. Thirdly, we have multinationals working in Malaysia. For example, they could be Japanese or Chinese or American or European companies working in Malaysia. Let me call them corporate Malaysia. And fourthly, we have the chambers of commerce that operate in various countries, including in China, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and so on. And finally, we have civil society, citizens, individuals, and everything else that makes up Malaysia and everyone else that makes up Malaysia as well. So Malaysia as an entity is really large and there's a lot of capacity out there. We shouldn't really rely only on government to solve these procurement issues for us. We should also rely on corporate Malaysia, multinationals, GLCs, SMEs, chambers of commerce, non-governmental organizations, civil societies, including individuals who do a lot of trade, or we may have friends or family or relatives in China and Vietnam and so on, and we should utilize everything we have. This is because outbreaks require an all-of-society solution. We cannot only rely on the Ministry of Health or the Director General of Health, who, by the way, I think are all doing a fantastic job. So salute to our frontliners. We are here for you. And when I say we are here for you, the we that I mean is all of Malaysia. And those are the constituent parts of Malaysia. So having looked at the different type parts of Malaysia, maybe these are 3 things that Malaysia can do right now. The first thing that Malaysia can do right now is to resolve the gap between donor and recipient. The second thing that Malaysia can do right now is to procure, and procure externally, and to procure externally now. The third thing that Malaysia can do right now is to build everything into a Malaysian strategy that can see us through the long haul. For example, stockpiles, appropriate distribution, and the likes, which I'll explore in turn. Now, these three elements over here, the first one being coordinating donor-recipient, let me call it the donor-recipient problem. Two, to procure now. And number three, to establish a strategic stockpile to see us through the next few weeks, cannot be done in turn. It's not one and then two and then three. They must be done in parallel. And that's why we need all of society. This in parallel, simultaneous, all of the above at the same time approach is very important. Let's look at the first one, donor-recipient problem. At the moment, we have a lot of people wanting to donate, and they're donating money. We have the GDRN, the GLC, Disaster Response Network, that's led by a secretariat in Yayasan Hasanah, an arm of Khazanah National, as well as many other GLCs. And I think that's one fund, and many other funds as well, as a outpouring of donations, and I think that's great. On the other hand, we don't know what the recipients need. Well, we kind of know, they need test kits, they need personal protective equipment, marginalized communities need food, and so on. But at the moment, we don't know who needs what, where, and when. During a crisis situation, that is the biggest question of all. Who needs what, where, and when? If you can coordinate these two with a central hub, for example, provided for by the government or a civil society leadership that matches donor to recipient so that they both know what the other person needs, that would be tremendously important. Because if you want to procure, you can't just go out and raise a lot of money and then blindly purchase what you think they need without really matching their needs to what you want to do to help. And that's an important portion of procurement as well. Obviously, data from the Ministry of Health is important. We need to know out of the 145 hospitals we have in Malaysia and the 1,000 or so clinic kesihatan that we have in Malaysia, who needs what, where, and when. If you can match the donor to the recipient, you can map out the dots of Malaysia. That is an important step in procurement. Otherwise, you're just procuring blindly. The second thing that Malaysia needs to do right now in parallel is to procure from China now. I don't want to be too dramatic, but we have to go in there and we have to buy everything now. Well, not everything, because we want to leave things behind for our neighbors in Southeast Asia and other countries around the world. Malaysia must be in a prosper by neighbor mode as well. Because if we are protected, but for example, Thailand or Indonesia or any other country are not protected, we might also be weakened as a result, because the whole world is fighting against COVID, not just Malaysia. But what we can do for Malaysia is to go into China, establish supply chains, and buy as much as we can for now. And when I say now, I mean now. We can do it in a few different ways. Government to government, or G to G, which is great, because I think our Foreign Affairs Ministry is dealing with a lot of the Chinese ambassador recently, and that's great. We can do chambers of commerce to company. We can do private sector to companies as well in China and manufacturers. We can definitely use the vendor network of the likes of Petronas, for example. We have a very well-established vendor development program that could retool a little bit, use their strategy and capacity and expertise to help us source for new sources of personal protective equipment, as well as ventilators and so on and so forth. But what we need to do is to diversify our supply chain and resources, go to China, go to Vietnam, go to Singapore, go to South Korea and Taiwan, and get as much as we can now. Because if we're not there now, we will be left behind in the queue. The world is going shopping. Malaysia can't be left behind. That's the second thing we should do. The first being coordinate donor to recipient so that people know what is happening. And the second thing we need to do is to buy everything now. The third one is having the coordination of a donor to recipient, and secondly, purchasing lines from China and other countries means that we're now able to do the third thing, which is to slowly establish a stockpile. The temptation is to procure everything now and then to load everything to the frontline hospitals, but we may need to establish a bit of a stockpile that we leave some things behind for a rainy day. The establishing of the stockpile is a very difficult resource allocation decision. And government must be, say, mindful about using enough into the front lines today to adequately protect everyone and to protect the health of the rakyat, but also to appropriately and strategically stockpile. We can't put everything in Klang Valley. We must also care for Sabah, Kelantan, Perlis, rural areas, marginalized communities. And that kind of strategic stockpile is important so that we can have multiple rounds of procurement at the same time backed up with more capacity building for our native industries. Ultimately, Ibrahim, procurement is going to be one of the more important things that we can do for Malaysia right now. We procure now and be very thoughtful about strategy going ahead. And I'm glad that we could speak about it today.
Thank you again for taking the time to speak with us, Dr. Khor. I'm pretty sure we'll be speaking a lot moving forward, but for the time being, we have to draw this conversation to a close. That was Dr. Khor Swee Kheng talking to us about how the Malaysian government needs to organize themselves into moving forward and buying more items for the frontliners, for the hospital services, for many others, including the backhanders right now. Remember, if you want to be part of this conversation, just tweet at me at Ibrahim Sani Net or tweet at 501 Awani. Share your views with us. Remember, this crisis is currently being averted. We are on the right track. Our numbers are nowhere near other crisis countries around the world. This MCO is working for us, largely because we are breaking the chain of infection by being at home. This is working. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay at home. If you've missed any part of this interview, just head on to astroawani.com. Look for Notepad over there. There's plenty of interviews like this that can be found over there. You can also listen to these kind of interviews on your mobile devices. Just download the Astro Awani app wherever you get the application. Till then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.